honored and excited about the, to have this opportunity. So let's get going. I want to talk today about the Waldo fire that burned a large number of structures in Colorado Springs. Before we get into the details of the presentation, there are a couple of announcements I want to make. First, this is really the result of a partnership between NIST, the Forest Service, and JFSP. And I really want to acknowledge that. With respect to all the participants that really enabled this study, there is a slide at the end of the presentation listing all of them, and we're just going to cover that a little bit later on. The second part that I really want to convey to you all before we get started with the details of the presentations, I encourage anyone who's interested to really take the time and study the report. It is a long report. We appreciate that, and we know it's going to take a lot of time, but the presentation is really a high-level summary of some of the ideas. The numbers have been simplified here to make things flow better and convey some messages, but the real information and all the details are in the report. So I really encourage folks who are interested in really learning about the Waldo to take the time to go through the report. All right. There are three findings that I want to discuss through the presentation today. And I will say that while this presentation here focuses on the Waldo fire, a lot of the information that we collected in many ways, we also found very similar patterns in the other case studies that we have done in Texas and in Southern California. So the number one issue I want to bring up is that WUI fires are different, and they're different across both space and time, and we have really seen how this manifested itself in Waldo, and we're going to cover that in detail. They are not wildland fires, and they're not urban fires, so we'll look at that. The second part, really key finding here, is that first responder defensive actions are very effective, and that has a number of significant implications. First of all, it's great news. The first responders are doing a tremendous job looking at the Waldo, and that has significant implications because the response effectiveness is so high. What we're really seeing after the fact is after the fire has gone through is really an integration of exposure, response, and defensive actions. So we really need to understand defensive actions in order to understand the fire scene. And that really brings us to the third one, the third bullet, and that is that exposure, both from fire numbers, really drive wildland-urban interface fire dynamics. And if we don't really focus on that, then we can be very easily misled in the field by what we see after the fact. So a little bit of brief background about the Waldo fire. It hit the Colorado Springs community June 26th. Before reaching the Mountain Shadows community, where we're going to spend most of our time here discussing, which was the focus of the report, the fire glanced at the Cedar Heights community. I'm saying glanced not because the fire wasn't severe, not because there wasn't significant defensive action activity. I'm saying glanced because the combination of fire dynamics, local weather, and defensive actions resulted in not a single structure in the Cedar Heights community having had any direct fire ember exposure. There were some fuel treatments done in that area, so there is a lot of interesting information there, and we have a very small description of that event in the report. But the main focus of the report is the Mountain Shadows community, where 344 homes were destroyed. And I want to point out very early on here that 95% of that destruction occurred within 6 hours after the front arrived, and we're going to see that evolution in that timeline. The fire then progressed to the north-northeast, and the next day on the 27th, there was a flare-up up in the mountain, and we had a very aggressive fire that came down to the peregrine community. And that's also another, there's another appendix in the report describing the peregrine timeline. No structures were destroyed. Loss was at a minimal, was kept really to a minimum, with just a limited number of ignitions of structures that were subsequently and very quickly put out by first responders who were already at the scene when the event occurred. I want to point out that the peregrine event and the mountain shadows event are not the same in scale. There are some comparisons in the report, but context really needs to be provided. Mountain shadows, the assault from the fires that came down from the mountains from the west was really not just severe in intensity, but also very broad in scale. The peregrine event was very focused, quite severe, but very focused and much smaller in geographic scale. So three very different community fire interactions, and the main focus here is going to be mountain shadows. In order to do this data collection, in order to do this investigation, we did over 200 technical discussions, and we spoke with over 250 first responders. We tracked them all around the U.S., all the mutual aids, some of which came from Northern California, and we went and got debriefed and understood what they saw and what they did. And in summary, in a nutshell, just to provide a sense of the scale of the effort, we have over 4,500 distinct fire observations and our defensive actions over the first 8 hours of the event. So this is a very data-rich domain, and we spend a very significant amount of time not only collecting the data, which took the better part of a year, but also cross-correlating the data. And there is a lot of information in the report specifically about the data collection and integration process, and I encourage you to take a look at those. So before we look at the details of the fire behavior and progression in the mountain shadows community, just a quick snapshot about exposure. You're gonna hear the term throughout the presentation: exposure, 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 which is really what drives the wildland-urban interface fire behavior. So we can have flame contact, we can have thermal radiation, or we can have embers. And I put two pictures for embers because the picture on the left, and that's courtesy of San Diego Fire Department from the witch fire. You see the streak right here where the arrow is. That's an ember flying through the air. Also during the witch fire, on the lower picture on the right, you see this glow, and that is literally a sea of embers migrating through, being pushed by the wind through the road. So embers really don't have to be onesies and twosies. They can be significant. They can be present in significant numbers, and this is an issue that really requires significant further research in the future. All right. So the initial front that hit the mountain shadow community resulted in 48 ignitions from the wildlands, from the wildland fire. These very quickly overwhelmed the traditional fire response, and within an hour we already had 100 structures, with structure-to-structure fire spread consuming a large number of all the destroyed homes. Again, I want to stress the fire dynamics of the event were quite complex, and a lot is explained in the report, so please look at that. The main point here is that when the fire came from the wildlands, and hit that community, it didn't destroy 344 homes and ignite another 100 homes all within a few minutes. The number of initial ignitions was limited. You can think of it nominally about 10% of the total documented ignitions. So what happened initially? This is part of the Mountain Shadows community. This is one of the areas where the fire came down different drainages from the mountains to the west, and to first order. This is about the size of the fire front. Obviously, it was more complex because the different drainages burned on different sides, but I just put that here just to convey a sense of scale, that it wasn't small, 1 or 2 parcel wide event. And the information we got from the first responders was that the conditions deteriorated very, very rapidly to the point where visibility was reduced to under 10 feet when the fire hit. Now, there was an event that occurred. Some people call it a plume lean. Other folks have called it a plume collapse. We have not looked at the dynamics of exactly why the plume ended up at the surface, but the information that we have is that in roughly this area, at about 1724 plus or minus a couple of minutes, when the front hit, winds went to estimating 60 plus miles an hour. To give you a sense of the magnitude, the winds were so severe that one of the doors on one of the command vehicles folded and landed on the hood. So very strong katabatic wind that came with the wind pushing down the mountain. Now, I want to point out that the visibility was not only obscured in the orange circle. In the yellow area, there was reduced visibility as well. And again, these are just very rough outlines, but just to give you a sense of scale. And in the red, people couldn't see to drive out. So they had to use AVL, essentially GPS, to navigate because they literally could not see the hood of the engines or of the trucks. Here in the yellow area, you could see to drive, but it was definitely obscured. Right. We're going to be looking at in 2 slides in some snapshots from a video taken here on Wilson Road, so right in the thick of things. And the video was taken exactly 1 hour after the fire front hit the community. And then after that, we're going to be looking at a video on Majestic, and that's 5.5 hours after the front passed. So quick summary of the event in terms of ignitions. We talked already about the ignitions nominally about 100 after the first hour. We have documented 250 after 3, and essentially by 5.5 hours, 98 or so % of the ignitions have already taken place, with very few exceptions. Everything was essentially consumed. So another way to look at this is that we were losing homes at a rate of 1 a minute. That is a very significant number, and it really puts in perspective the type of response that we should be thinking about. And I also want to mention that the first 100 ignitions really contributed to the remaining 350. In the report, we describe a lot of the details about the structure-to-structure fire spread, but it is a complex environment, and this really just, I want to convey to you how quickly everything happened here, more than how the fire spread across the domain. All right, so this is really a unique graph, and very possibly the first of its kind, where we show where we're able to track through the 200 plus technical discussions the number of apparatus in mountain shadows. And in red, we have cumulative apparatus, so we can see engines going in and more engines end up in the community. In the blue, we have net apparatus, and that is we're tracking engines going in, but actually how many engines are in the community at any one time. And this tip over here represents the first evacuation of the first responders when they pulled back to a safety zone. And then resources started coming back in. This is the 1 hour mark, and on the next slide you're going to see some snapshots of what it looked like an hour into the incident, and then we reached a pseudo-steady state of 60 to 70 rigs, 3 or so hours, 2 to 3 hours in the event. I want to also provide just a quick sense of perspective here. For urban fires in Colorado Springs, they have a very good track record with response times of 7 to 9 minutes. A couple of other things to point out. There was a wind shift, and the wind abated about 3 hours into the event. Very significant. It really enabled significant activities, defensive actions from the first responders, and enabled them to do a lot of the containment. And I should point out here that when we say defensive actions in the context of this presentation and the report, defensive actions here mean any and all actions taken by first responders. They're not just defensive. They can be pre-wetting, they can be stopping an ignition, they can be containing a fire, containing a parcel, containing a structure, any and all. The last thing to mention here before we move on, the last mutual aid task force arrived, well into the night. All right, so now let's look at what that community looked like, where we had the visibility of less than 10 feet when the fire front hit. This is what it looked like an hour after the arrival of the fire front. You can see blue sky, and yes, there is some smoke, but a large fraction of the smoke locally here is associated with the contributions of this structure on fire. The other thing I want to point out is that you can see there are some veg ignitions over here, but overall, very limited number of observed ignitions. And this is from a GoPro that was on the dashboard of one of the engines, and gave us tremendous amount of information as they drove, because they were one of the first scouts in the community. All right, so now we're going to look at snapshots from our next video, which we're showing here, that were taken 5.5 hours into the event. So this is what it looks like, essentially a sea of foundations. And you can see on the lower right a couple of first responders taking a stand and actually saving this structure. So the successful defensive actions. All right. So the main point here is that WUI fires are very different in time. The events can unfold very, very quickly. Now, I would like to take a couple of minutes and compare them to urban fires and wildfires. So in wildfires, the event can, a wildfire can burn easily for days, if not weeks, and occasionally months. So there is time available to coordinate the deployment. Just to give you a sense, when the Waldo became Type 1, the Type 1 team took 24 hours to get to the scene. If we look at the other side, urban, SOPs are already in place to deal with scenarios that are anticipated within the community. Just as an example, because when the city that has box stores and you go to the local fire department, they'll tell you what plans they have for responding to to such and such box store. Then they know where the water is, what are the issues inside the store, how many rigs they're going to show up with, evacuation, etc., etc., etc. So this has been pre-planned. In WUI, what we're finding is that really time is of the essence. In WUI fires, minutes count because the event is over, in the case of the Waldo, in just a few hours. So you don't have we don't have the luxury to build up the plan in real time. We have to be ready if we want to respond safely and rapidly. All right. The second reason the WUI fires are different is that exposure varies across different scales in WUI, in the wildland-urban interface. So around communities, we can have a topographic feature lined up with wind and high vegetative fuel loads causing very significant exposures. This is part of the Mountain Shadows community right here. But also, we can have high-density structures, which changes the exposure and the fire dynamics, and in that environment, we can have potentially structure-to-structure fire spread. And when we zoom in even further, then we look at the, we look at the parcel level, the ignition vulnerabilities, and the local exposures which really drive what's going on, whether there are combustible decks, fences, railroad ties, secondary buildings, and so on and so forth. So there are different scales, but they all really need to be addressed in context, because the fire is, what we have seen, very opportunistic, and looking at those vulnerabilities works through the community, creating locally significant exposures and propagating. All right. So now let's talk about defensive actions. Before we go into the details of the defensive actions, I'll say that we have what we believe to be about 98% or so of defensive actions on structures accounted for. We know that there are a few that we missed, but we do believe that we captured probably at least 96, if not 98%. Parcels, however, is a different story because we know from our discussions with first responders that they could not keep track of all the vegetative fires around the community in their mind. They just couldn't keep track of it. So we have a number of parcels that were defended and a number of structures that were defended, about 1 in 3. However, given all the information that we have in terms of overall defensive actions, it's possibly more like half of every parcel/structure in that community were defended over the first 8 hours of the event. This is very significant. This is really very significant because what this tells us is that defensive actions actually alter the WUI fire scene, and they alter the WUI event severity and the extent of losses. So this has huge implications about looking forward at the WUI fire problem. Defensive actions can be a critical part of reducing losses when done safely and effectively. And here we have tremendous data to show how this all worked out. So let's look now at some of the information that we collected specifically with respect to saving structures. On the left here, we have that 3 out of 4 times structures on fire were extinguished successfully and the structures were saved, which is a tremendous response. A quarter of the time they were not. So what I would like now to do is dive into this 25% and look at this a little bit more before we look at the the success of containing the fire to the structure of origin. So stopping the fire from spreading, if we take that 75% that we had, where we had successful extinguishment, and then look at the remaining 25%, what we see is that 19% of the time, they were able to successfully contain the fire, and it's only 6% where they couldn't put it out or contain it. So I would like to now just take a quick look at some of the tools used before we go further into containment. So overall, we have very successful extinguishment effectiveness. And what we see here is, if we look at the tools that were used on undamaged structures, because we have over 150 structures that were successfully defended where ignition was prevented, we see that it's not all big water. Yes, we have deck guns, and we have a lot of fire hose activities, but we also have a lot of structure prep and a lot of garden hose activities that were done. So this tells us that there is the resources available were leveraged and very successfully leveraged to prevent structure ignitions, and that can be of value in planning for responding to future incidents. And we saw some of these garden hose activities and structure preps being very successful, particularly in low exposure environments, where it was tenable and safe to use such tools. So now let's look at defensive actions specifically with respect to containment actions. Now, containment here is used in the context of preventing fires from spreading to other structures. And here the numbers are even more encouraging, if you will, or they're really great. 4 out of 5 times. First responders, when they set out to contain a fire at the structure level, 4 out of 5 times they were very successful. So like we did before, let's dive in now and look at why they were unsuccessful here. And you notice that I intentionally did not put failures here, and you'll see why. So what we see here on this figure is a map where the different colors mean different structure densities. And red are the high structure densities, and green is lower. What we see is that in 12 out of the 16 cases where the structures were unsuccessfully contained, we are in high density environments. This is high density, and this is very high density. To give you a sense of what type of density we're talking about here, in this area of Majestic, we had 3-foot setbacks from the property line. So you could stand between 2 structures and reach out and with your fingertips touch both homes. So that's 6 feet between structures. What we're seeing here is we're seeing failures in environments where realistically the first responders cannot abstract, cannot remove the energy and prevent structures from igniting other structures from these cascading events. So this is an important consideration, and it requires thought about how to address this issue from a evacuation and first responder safety and first responder effectiveness perspective. So what we saw here is that structural density really impacted containment. And that's a very important lesson because it's really, that structural density was in large part a key factor in the number of losses from the Waldo. All right. I want to talk a little bit about post-fire data collection. This is the area, I'll take a step back just to put, so now we are right in here. You see those 3 orange, we're right here. Okay, so this is the area of Majestic where we had almost complete destruction except here. So I want to point out that if the data collection is not done very thoroughly and with a strict methodology and followed all the way through to the end, we can end up drawing very, very wrong conclusions. And what we have found from the Waldo, and it's explicitly stated in the report, is that if you want to do, if you want to understand fire behavior at the interface, there is really no other way other than to go through and do these very detailed reconstructions, because without them you can get very, very erroneous data. If you just do a rapid assessment and take a snapshot of what the community looks like, and you don't understand the contributions of the defensive action, you don't understand the contributions of exposure in the context of time and space, you can really draw very different conclusions, and they can be very dangerous. So, is there an opportunity for rapid WUI post-fire assessments? Absolutely. There is a critical need for rapid WUI post-fire assessments. However, we feel that it makes a lot more technical sense for rapid WUI post-fire assessments to focus on recording all damage and destruction. And that is not, when we say rapid WUI, ideally we're not talking about a street drive-by. Ideally, a rapid damage assessment would have the first responders doing it, do a 360 around the home to identify those ignitions. And what that can do is it can dramatically aid us in identifying construction vulnerabilities, which is key to improving the construction in the future through code standards, test methods, and the adoption of those. So just one example of why you really have to take this all the way to the end and see it through. We had done 150 technical discussions, and for the first 150, everybody said, "Oh, we don't know what happened here. We weren't here. We did nothing to these structures. We don't know what happened." So if we had stopped at 150, those surviving structures would be the miracle homes, all right? And there would be miracles because of fill in the blank. At discussion 151, we found the task force that was here for the entire evening. And they aggressively fought and saved those structures. But we went all the way through and kept going until discussion 210. Where we felt we had covered the information and had cross-correlated data and got a sense that we spoke with at least one, and in many cases 2 or 3 or even 4 persons of every apparatus that was in there during the first 8 hours. All right. So let's talk about exposure. What drives exposure? And when we say exposure, again, it's fire and embers. It's really, we can simplify it, and we think of, when we talk about exposure, the way it is laid out, this way it matches the exposure scale framework that we've put out here at NIST with Roddy from the Forest Service. It's really fuels, terrain, and weather. So fuels are both vegetative and non-vegetative. And exposure, I've mentioned a couple of times before, it's very dynamic. It's space and time. The wildland fire moves through, the exposure can be very severe, but the residence time is very short, relatively speaking, because the half-life of those burning fuels in the wildland, the fuels get consumed pretty quickly. So the fire moves, hits the community. Once you have those ignitions of vegetation in the community, they can help the ignition of non-vegetative fuels. And once we get homes burning, those can burn for a very long time. Those don't burn in, for 3 or 5 minutes. Structure can burn for, an hour or even 2 hours, creating a significant exposure around it and downwind in the context of embers. Terrain, absolutely. Key player here, we have it simplified in terms of flat, sloped, and canyon. We can be thinking about fire sheds. The orientation of topographical features has a huge impact on what really happens. We've seen it here, but we've also seen it in Amarillo, where a fire burns down one canyon, but because of the wind, one side of the canyon burns, the other doesn't. And weather. Of course, fuel moisture, but also local wind. And by local, it's really local. It's what happens at the scale of where the fuels are, at a parcel level, really. That drives what's going on there in the context of that local exposure. Impacts, the rapid fire spread in the WUI really, this has very significant, it causes significant problems. Simultaneous multiple ignitions, that can result also in compressed evacuation times. That was the case here in Mountain Shadows. Harder to contain, higher firefighter exposure, to the toxic gases from burning structures and other combustibles in the WUI is a significant concern, and this is going to require significant attention. Is one of our findings. And of course, increased property losses. So I want to briefly talk about a couple of points we've identified with defensible space, some limitations to some of the current approaches. One here is that this high-density build environment doesn't really mesh with defensibility from structure to structure fire spread. So, we can encourage homeowners to, clean their lot, and maybe we can remove, 50 pounds of fuel, but, here in this type of environment, you can end up with 15,000 pounds of fuel 6 feet away. So we are not capturing that, and that is important because we're not capturing it, and we can provide a false sense of security to the homeowners, but also it affects how we view this environment from a response perspective. And what we have in the report is that really you want, in this type of environment, you really have to prevent fire from getting in there. It's not a question of having a community that can handle or adapt to fire and let fire move through it. Once that fire gets in there, it's very hard to stop it from burning the entire thing down. And what happens when we take a step back and look further out, what we see, and this is the same area, this majestic is all this right here, is really, from a defensible space approach, we are looking at 30 feet out or 100 feet out from the structure. What we're seeing here is landscape, almost landscape scale effects of canyons that create significant exposure conditions to those structures, well beyond the 30 or 100 feet away from those structures. So what can we do? Essentially, in addressing the WUI problem, we can bin our technical path forward in 3 different categories. We can mitigate exposure, so we can do this by hardening the targets, so we can harden the structures. That's one way to reduce the losses. And we can do that through improved designs and materials and codes and standards. But we can also attenuate the source. So fuel treatments external to the community can add value. And in parentheses here, those are all the recommendations that refer to these different parts of addressing the WUI problem, the 13 recommendations that are in the report. Fuel treatments. Let me go back one step. This area over here, for instance, would be a prime spot potentially for a fuel treatment that would enable the exposure here to be reduced, potentially enabling first responders to remain if the training was there and the understanding of exposure, to quickly stop any spot fires before the fire got deep-seated in here and the community really got lost. And the last path forward here is improving WUI-specific responses. And that is tactics and standard operating procedures and specifically training. And we discussed in the presentation earlier that in WUI fires, time is really of the essence. But what we say in the report, and I want to stress here, is that rapid deployment of resources has to be done safely. It has to be well thought out, and there's a lot of science that is needed and thought that needs to go into developing these WUI-specific tactics. So in summary, the fires are different. WUI fires are different in time, ignition rates, and space. We see cascading ignitions, and that is not just structure to structure next to each other in the high density, but we've seen and documented in the report a lot of spotting from structure to structure, which is really important. The offensive actions are very effective, both in terms of saving structures that have ignited, preventing structures from ignition, and also containment. And lastly, addressing the WUI problem, there's 3 categories: increasing ignition resistance, reducing exposure, and improving WUI-specific responses. We're on time. So lastly, as I mentioned when we started the presentation, I want to acknowledge all of our collaborators here. This could not have been done without the City of Colorado Springs, particularly Fire Marshal Lacey and Chief DeBay, along with Fire Protection Engineer Smith, and all the, in addition to Colorado Springs, all the mutual aid that came to the rescue of Colorado Springs, both local and remote. And lastly, I'd like to thank Mountain Shadow residents, a number of who provided to us some critical information about the event. Thank you very much. I encourage you to take the time and read the report. And with that, I think I'm going to say thank you and I'll turn it over to Stacy and Chris.
All right. Thank you so much, Alex. So with that, we're going to start our question and answer session. So the best way to do this is type your answers in the chat box. I'll show them in the Q&A, read them off, and have Alex answer them. So Alex, your first question is, would you define high density for the structures? How many homes per square mile or acre?
Yes, that information in terms of the actual densities illustrated in the figure are in the report on number of homes per acre. And I won't give just one number because we have multiple. As you remember from the figure, there are multiple colors. I just wanted to highlight here the idea of high versus low, but we see that it's a continuum, and there are a number of categories that are listed in the report, I believe, in terms of structures per square mile. And let me see if I can not.
Why don't you go ahead and look that up? I can do some housekeeping things real quick while you're looking that up.
Sure.
So, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to keep going with QA in a second here, but I wanted to point out a few things. In the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a box that says Web Links. At any time, you can click on that, say Browse to, and that will open in a new window for you. So the first link is the webinar evaluation. This is about 10 questions. It's pretty short. Just pick a few numbers if you want to. You can type in more. And this not only helps us to improve future webinars, but also helps us for our reporting back to our funding organization. So it's very helpful, and I would really appreciate it if you take, like I said, like 5 minutes or less to fill that out. The next one is a link to the webinar page for Alex's talk today, and that's where the recording for this presentation and the PDF of the slides will be up. Also, on that same page, it is our WUI webinar series page. So if this talk interested you, we're going to have a couple more coming up. The next webinar is in March, and it is with Nicola Lishan from Oklahoma State University, Changing Risk in 3 Differing Southern California Communities, a GIS approach, and that is on March 3rd at 11 a.m. And future ones include a report April on the Valley Fire, a webinar in May about state regulations regarding single-axis subdivisions and if they actually work, and then finally we'll wrap up in June with a 2016 Butte case fire study. And lastly is a link to the study that Alex is talking about today. Okay, that's all I had. Go ahead, Alex. We'll get back to Q&A.
Thank you, Stacy. To give people a sense on the perimeter of that, let me go back real quick here, get to that. Okay, sorry, right there. The perimeter, we're looking at between 0.8 and 2.5 structures per hectare. And in the very high density, right here in the middle of Majestic, we're between 7.3 and 12 structures per hectare. So these are the numbers in the report, and it's map figure 13 in the report. Great question.
The next one for you is, what type of specific training for fire responses did you have in mind?
That is a great question. I can tell you some rough numbers. Only about somewhere between 10 and 20% of the first responders we spoke with about 250 of them, were specifically trained in the WUI. We had a number of first responders that were only trained in structural firefighting, and we had a number of first responders that were only trained in wildland. That caused some challenges in the context of response. Using some of the current training, I think can add significant value, and enabling people to really understand the events and anticipate based on the information such as the data that we collected here, can really help. One of the big issues that we want to further enhance our understanding of where we think we're going to see high exposures, both in space and time, and share that information with first responders to enable them not to be in harm's way.
Okay, great answer. The next one coming at you is, what mitigations has the Mountain Shadows community enacted since the fire?
I think it's, I'm not going to be able to explicitly ask that. I'm going to direct folks to, go to the Mountain Shadows, to the Colorado Springs website and talk with the folks directly. I don't want to speak for Colorado Springs. There are a few things that I can say, however. There are some ordinance, there are some mitigation activities that were in the book, so to speak, before the fire. Some mandatory, some voluntary activities, some mandatory in terms of construction, some voluntary in terms of fuel removal. I know that the fire marshal has been working on trying to remove some of the combustibles within the community, and certain things are more readily achievable than others. For instance, in this very high density environment, you cannot remove the fuel. You cannot say, okay, don't build here when people have already, when people have their structures there in their lots. But some improved construction and hardened construction requirements have been implemented. Let me give you a little bit more on that. About 10 years ago or so, we did a number of experiments at NIST, and they're documented in NIST Technical Note 1600, and those were structure separation experiments. So we built 2 structures in our lab. One structure was a 2-story facade, and on the lower level there was a living room behind the 2-story facade. And then 6 feet away we had another 2-story facade, which was meant to simulate a neighboring structure. We did one experiment. The first experiment, we ignited the contents of the living room, the sofa, on fire, and in about three minutes or so, the window broke, and from the moment the flames came out the window, in 80 seconds, your neighbor's home, which was unrestricted construction, caught on fire. 80 seconds. We replicated the experiment, and what we did is we put a fire-resistant barrier behind the vinyl, which didn't really contribute. The vinyl just melted away and exposed the underlayment of the structure. And with the fire-resistant barrier, we weren't able to get the fire to spread. Now, that experiment does not say that if you add a fire-resistant barrier, that you will never get fire to spread, because there were a number of things that didn't enhance fire spread. For instance, we didn't have any eaves. It was not complex construction. We didn't have any windows lined up, so the window breaking on one structure didn't break the window on the other structure, and we didn't have any wind helping it. So, but it illustrated the benefits, some of the benefits that could be afforded by fire-resistant construction, and this is one of the things that Colorado Springs is doing, particularly in the high-density areas. They have increased their building requirements to provide some additional enhancements in the context of ignition resistance.
Okay, that was great. Looks like we might have time for 1 or 2 more. So the next one, it's a multi-answer question here, but do the R1, R2, etc. relate to report recommendations? And if so, are they recommended or in priority order? And if so, would that suggest that the priority... Oh, sorry, I got cut off there. 1 second. That the priority recommendations, i.e. R1, R2, etc., are targeted at responders rather than residents?
The recommendations are grouped in different categories, and to zeroth order, yes, they are prioritized, but I wouldn't say that R2 is not important. R2 is very important, as is R1. The recommendations are really targeted at first responders. See, obviously, they have implications for homeowners. And I think that as the science matures here and the information that we collected during the Waldo and possibly other similar studies in the future are available to not only homeowners but also city officials, that's going to give them ammunition to enable them to communicate to the homeowners the sense of potential urgency in timely evacuations and pre-planning and all of that. But they are primarily aimed at first responders. And I want to say that the response for the Waldo was really a great response in many ways. The defensive actions were extremely effective, as we discussed, and there aren't many areas in the country where we can get 60 or 70 apparatus in a couple of hours. But the point we want to make is time is of the essence. So just to give you one other sense of this, why pre-planning is so critical. When I went and presented some of this information to the chief of Colorado Springs, Chief Riley, I told him, look, we're losing the structures at a rate of 1 a minute. And he initially thought, well, is that the right number? And I said, yeah, but here it is. And he told me, he said, not many people appreciate how quickly these things really take place. So the message I got to him was, no, if you're, as an example, said, if you're standing with your map on the hood of the Suburban or your Tahoe, figuring out how you're going to lay this out, how you're going to set up your divisions, who's going to be where, who's available, all of that stuff, potentially some of which could have been done before if we had a plan, a path forward for doing this, and that's a big if. We wouldn't be while you're doing all of this in the background, we wouldn't be losing 1 a minute. And it's actually even more than 1 a minute, because for every home that ignites on the front end, we can lose several after the fact. So the response was very good, but what we have identified here is really a need at a national level to develop a framework for how communities, specifically first responders first and then communities, should think about WUI events in their communities and how they should pre-plan and prepare the same way we're preparing for structural fires.
With that, we have a minute left. I want to say thank you for everyone who joined us today on this webinar. We had 45 participants during the presentation, and so obviously an issue that a lot of people are interested in. Thank you also to Chris Dykes from Cal Poly, who runs the WUI section of the California Fire Science Consortium, for putting this and other upcoming WUI webinars together. And finally, a great big thank you to Alex. This is obviously an issue that's, like I said, not going away, and it's really important to a lot of people. So thank you for your contributions and for sharing with us today.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to seeing some of your other webinars in the future.
All right, great. And one last thing, too, I will send that email out to everybody who registered with all these links and the recording when it's up. So thanks again, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.